She struck the flame and touched it to the bedsheet near her knees. The cloth caught faster than she expected. She screamed at once. The ward erupted. Nurses rushed in. Orderlies shouted. One tried to beat down the flames while another cut at the restraint straps. Smoke rolled upward. 2 patients began shrieking. A third was already kicking at the end of her bed. By the time Eleanor was untied, the room had become exactly what institutions fear most: disordered human panic. In the winter of 1976, St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution stood above the river like a building designed not to heal the mind, but to sort it. Its windows were tall and barred. Its stone walls sweated in the cold. Its corridors smelled of bleach, boiled linen, and the sweet chemical sleep by which difficult patients were taught to become quieter versions of themselves. At the rear of the hospital, connected by a glass passage no visitor ever used, stood the administrative annex. Not merely an office wing, but the local face of Annex itself, the vast civic corporate authority whose revisions, certifications, and quiet interventions reached into hospitals, courts, schools, labor offices, and ministries alike. St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution answered to doctors and inspectors on paper. In practice, it answered to Annex. A woman woke in Ward C under the name Eleanor Voss. A nurse told her she had suffered a collapse after a violent disturbance in the night ward. Dr. Halden, the physician assigned to her, told her memory often returned badly, if at all, and that she must not exhaust herself trying to force it. He spoke gently enough that the warning sounded like care. Eleanor accepted the name they gave her because the broken mind clings first to whatever is spoken with confidence. She remembered no family, no home, no work. Only fragments survived: the clatter of a typewriter, the smell of carbon paper, a red string around a stack of files, and a feeling, stronger than memory, that somewhere a terrible mistake had been made on purpose. For weeks, the days passed under heavy sedation. The first fracture came a month later after the evening bath. While a nurse brushed her hair, Eleanor saw in the mirror not her own uncertain face, but the flash of another woman's mouth forming one name with exhausted insistence. She could not understand what the name was. The image vanished at once. That night, half drugged with sedatives, Eleanor dreamed of a narrow room with scratched plaster and a child's hand writing the same name over and over until the letters cut through skin. Again the letters appeared blurred and she could not discern what was written. She woke with that name under her tongue and no idea why it tasted like grief. The next night the sedatives took hold before supper. They did not bring ordinary sleep. They brought fragments. In one dream, she stood before a filing cabinet with drawer 7 pulled open. Inside were not records, but patient bracelets, wedding rings, and photographs with faces burned away. In another, she heard a woman coughing behind a partition, while a man's voice nearby said that once a name was retired, the person attached to it became manageable. When she woke, her right fingertips were black with typewriter ink. A few days later, Detective Corbin visited. He asked whether anything had returned to her, not in the manner of a man seeking truth, but of one measuring how much danger might already be awake behind her eyes. She said she remembered nothing. Corbin replied that institutions become interested in memory only when it threatens paperwork. Before leaving, he placed an intake card on her blanket and asked whether she knew the name on it. Agnes Vale. The card trembled in Eleanor's hands. She could not say she knew the handwriting. She could not say she knew the face in the blurred staff photograph clipped to the form. Yet something in her reacted not as though she had been shown evidence, but as though she had been shown something stolen from her. After that, Agnes began appearing inside her mind not as a stranger, but as pressure. She would hear attendants call her Eleanor and feel the wrongness of it before the sound had fully landed. She began writing a V in the margins of crossword pages without knowing why. Once, while being escorted through the lower hall for evaluation, she passed the glass corridor linking St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution to the annex and saw, for 1 second only, a reflection in the pane. Not a patient in a hospital robe, but a woman in office shoes carrying a red file bundle to her chest and turning towards some unseen horror behind her. She was never free to wander. Ward C was locked. Night sedation was heavy. Shoes were counted, belts removed, windows latched. Yet each morning brought signs that some part of her had been moved while drugged or had moved under orders she could not consciously remember. Plaster dust on her cuffs. The next fracture came from bed 7. The woman had been muttering for days in a language no nurse claimed to understand. On the 5th night, just before the injection fully dimmed the ward, she rolled toward Eleanor and pressed a folded carbon slip into her palm. It contained only one repeated line: "Name to be retired."
By morning, bed 7 was gone from the ward. No nurse would say where. That afternoon, while Eleanor sat under supervision in the day room, shouting broke out in the east corridor. Patients rose, orderlies ran. Through the wired glass of the inner door, she saw bed 7 being dragged past by 2 attendants, barefoot and wild-eyed, still trying to wrench herself free. Someone said she had tried to get out through the service stair. Someone else said she kept screaming that they would burn her name next. They took her to the isolation room below the treatment wing, the windowless chamber lined in thick padding where sound went in loud and came back small. An hour later, the smell of smoke reached the ward. No one ever explained properly how the fire started. The attendants called it electrical fault. The nurses called it tragic agitation. But by evening, the corridor was full of the hush that follows an event everyone has witnessed and no one intends to describe honestly. Some whispers grew that the room was locked in a way that no one could get in or out. Bed 7 was not seen again. Later that afternoon, Eleanor was taken downstairs for review. Not to the treatment rooms, not to the hydrotherapy hall. Lower. Beneath the hospital, St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution kept an old records office that had once handled intake revisions, transfers, and correspondence with the administrative annex. Now it served mostly as storage, though certain rooms remained in use. Though sedated, Eleanor remained clear enough to understand that fear had finally found its grammar. She was seated outside while Dr. Halden met with a gray-suited administrator from the annex in an office whose door had not fully closed. Through the gap, she heard enough to know that St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution was not protecting itself alone. It was protecting a machinery much larger than its walls. There had been a security breach in the annex 1 month before her admission. A clerk had refused to cooperate. A patient body had since been found in the isolation room fire. If Eleanor's signature would appear in the right forms, the body could be attached to the right name and the remainder of the matter resolved. The 2 men stepped away. On the desk between them sat a typewriter with a fresh carbon sheet still in the carriage. Eleanor saw only part of the page before it was removed. Agnes Vale, retired. Eleanor Voss, corrective identity approved. That was when she understood the shape of the danger, though not yet the whole of it. That night the sedatives failed.
Or perhaps something in her had finally grown too frightened to sleep properly. She woke in a small room not her own, sitting at a typewriter before a carbon stack, her wrists strapped loosely to the chair, as though someone expected drowsy obedience rather than resistance. On the wall before her hung 3 intake photographs of the same woman taken months apart. The first was labeled Agnes Vale. The second, Agnes/unstable revision. The third, Eleanor Voss. The face in all 3 was hers. Memory returned not in sequence, but in force. She had been Agnes Vale. She had worked in the administrative annex, typing transfers, certification forms, name corrections, and retirement notices. She knew how the institution translated harm into language mild enough to survive inquiry. A little more than a month before she woke in Ward C, she had stayed late and seen what she was never meant to see: a hidden set of files connecting psychiatric admissions to administrative identity replacement. The annex was selecting troublesome people, patients, witnesses, complainants, employees who knew too much, and retiring their names through medical language, sedation, and fabricated breakdowns. St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution was not the origin of the system. It was one of its hands. The hospital received those whom Annex needed corrected, erased, softened, or returned to the world under safer identities. What Agnes found that night was not merely a hidden filing system, but a working arrangement between Annex and selected institutions by which inconvenient persons could be rewritten as unstable, admitted, corrected, and either discharged under safer names or disappeared inside the record itself. Agnes had refused to keep typing. She had threatened to expose the whole system. The next morning, she woke in St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution as Eleanor Voss, medicated, fragmented, and entered into the very machinery she had meant to expose. They had not merely punished her. They had begun converting her into evidence against herself.
Then came the final understanding. The ashes of the body found in the isolation room fire would be used as hers. Agnes Vale would be declared dead. Eleanor Voss would be declared unstable, violent, and responsible enough to close the file, but broken enough never to be believed. The institution would lose an employee and gain a convenient story. At that thought, another face rose before her mind, not Agnes, not Eleanor, but the gaunt woman from bed 7 who had given her the note. Eleanor understood then that the institution intended the body in the ash to become Agnes Vale on paper. Bed 7 had known. Bed 7 had recognized the pattern because she herself had likely been waiting for the same administrative correction. The straps at Eleanor's wrists had been tied for compliance, not struggle. That was the Annex's final arrogance. It had mistaken sedation for surrender. As she twisted free, her hand struck the metal tray beside the chair and closed around a nurse's lighter left there carelessly beside a packet of cigarettes and the typewriter ribbons. Before they returned her upstairs, she slipped it into the sleeve of her hospital robe. They returned her to Ward C near midnight, believing the drugs would finish what the chair and carbon sheets had begun. But the memory of Agnes had now become too complete to sleep under. She lay tied to the bed by the wrists, the restraint straps drawn tightly enough to prevent any useful movement, and listened to the ward settle into the breathing, muttering dark of medicated sleep. Then she remembered the lighter hidden in the sleeve of her robe, the robe itself crumpled beneath the blanket at the foot of the bed, where the nurses had tossed it after the examination. It took her several minutes to drag the cloth close enough with one bare foot. By then she was crying from effort and fear.
At last, her fingers found the sleeve seam. She felt the shape of the lighter inside it. For one long second, she held it without moving and understood the shape of the choice before her: to die in that bed under their chosen name, or trust chaos and whatever fate had planned for her next. Then, with the kind of courage despair sometimes lends the nearly erased, she struck the flame and touched it to the bedsheet near her knees. The cloth caught faster than she expected. She screamed at once. The ward erupted. Nurses rushed in. Orderlies shouted. One tried to beat down the flames while another cut at the restraint straps. Smoke rolled upward. 2 patients began shrieking. A third was already kicking at the end of her bed. By the time Eleanor was untied, the room had become exactly what institutions fear most: disordered human panic. She stumbled free in the confusion, still clutching the lighter. At the ward door, she turned once, touched the flame to the hanging drape beside the oxygen trolley, and watched the fire leap upward with terrifying gratitude. Then, while the staff rushed to free the others before the blaze sealed the corridor, Eleanor slipped into the hall and went down toward the records room before the building could decide whether to save its patients or its paperwork. She still knew where the records room lay and what proof slept there in cabinets too certain of surviving till morning. She broke the glass of the lower office, forced the lock from within, and entered the records room while smoke moved through the vents overhead. There she stole what she could carry: red string files, transfer ledgers, retired name lists, carbon copies bearing her own original signature, and one master ledger linking St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution admissions to Annex Corrections. The ledgers did not stop at the institution. There were references to schools, correctional wards, civil offices, labor tribunals, and clinics in other districts, all bound by the same stamped header. She could remember it all now. By the time she reached the service corridor, sparks were already falling from the ceiling plaster. The river exit lay beyond the laundry hall. She took it.
Outside, in the black cold behind the hospital, Eleanor, Agnes, stood for 1 second between 2 possible deaths. The one the institution had prepared for her on paper, and the one that would follow if she remained visible. They would certainly be looking for her. So she chose the old human tactic by which the powerless sometimes preserve truth. She vanished herself before power could finish doing it for her. 2 days later, a packet of scorched files tied in red string arrived on the desk of a provincial newspaper editor who still believed names mattered more than institutions. Inside were transfer authorizations, identity revisions, ward reports, and one note written in a hand made shaky by smoke and exhaustion. It said, "Look for the truth in Annex." By then, St. Bartholomew's Psychiatric Institution had already issued its statement. A patient had died in the fire. Several records were lost. Administrative irregularities were under review. No employee named Agnes Vale had worked for the institution in any recognized capacity. No patient named Eleanor Voss survived the blaze. Perhaps Annex thought that would be enough. Often it had been. The hospital could be blamed, the fire could be filed, the body could be named, and the larger machinery could go on speaking through cleaner buildings elsewhere. For the most dangerous powers are no longer those that rule by open force, but those vast enough to borrow hospitals, courts, and records offices as extensions of their will, until the inconvenient are not imprisoned or executed, but corrected out of existence. And sooner or later, every institution that retires the inconvenient soul
and calls the result order, earns its place into the light beyond shadow.